Chapter 1. 14 years ago. When the call came, Maurice Weber had just returned from walking Frankie, his 8-year-old German Shepherd, at the park. Maurice had recently turned 60, and he was feeling every bit his age. Some would say that 60 was the new 40, but Maurice didn't see it that way. His joints ached whenever he tried going up and down the stairs. He was constantly reaching over for his reading glasses, and he was already on half a dozen prescription medications for a variety of ailments: glaucoma, arthritis, angina, not to mention anxiety and depression. Maurice wasn't always like that. Less than a decade ago, he was vibrant and full of good health. He ate well, slept well, and exercised on a regular basis. He even had a career that he adored. Life was good. But it all changed after the accident. Maurice was riding his bicycle one foggy morning. It had rained the night before, so the roads were covered in a thin layer of moisture. On a sharp turn, one he had taken dozens of times before, the bike's tire slipped, and Maurice found himself in a ditch, some 20 feet from the road. Maurice had on a helmet, so there wasn't any damage to his head. But the fall had shattered his left femur and broken several bones in his right hand. The accident was no one's fault but his. He should have known better than go riding on that day. The subsequent surgeries left him stuck in bed, riddled with pain, and on more drugs than he'd taken his entire life. Fortunately, he had the support of his son, Jeffrey, and his daughter-in-law, Leslie, who were by his side throughout the entire recovery. He also had his 2 grandkids, Luke and Bryce, who never stopped telling him how much they loved him. Without any of them, Maurice wasn't sure how he'd had managed to get over the ordeal. So when the caller on the phone said it was about Jeffrey, Maurice didn't even bother finishing his cup of coffee, which he usually drank after his walk with Frankie. Instead, he left raw food in Frankie's bowl and rushed out of the house. The drive from his place to Jeffrey's was almost 200 miles. Maurice hated going on long drives. He found he could no longer sit for long stretches behind the wheel. His back would ache, and his legs would cramp. He was also constantly making pit stops. When he'd reached Milton, he got off the main road and drove down a dirt path. He spotted a house in the distance. Victorian style, with a triangular roof and decorated columns, and it was painted in a variety of colors. As he approached, he spotted 2 vehicles parked in the driveway. One belonged to the sheriff's department. The other, a green-colored sedan. He wasn't sure who it belonged to. He parked behind the sheriff's cruiser and got out. The moment he did, the cruiser's door opened, and the sheriff came out. "Mr. Weber," he said. "I'm Sheriff Mark Halstead. I was the one you spoke to over the phone." Halstead was tall, slim, and clean-shaven. He didn't look a day over 30. Maurice shook the sheriff's extended hand. A man appeared next to Halstead. He must have been sitting in the green sedan, Maurice concluded. The man was short and balding, and he had an unkempt mustache that covered his upper lip. "This is Mr. Saul Billings," Halstead said. "He's the owner of the property." Maurice frowned. "Owner? I didn't know Jeffrey was renting this place." Billings said, "After he sold it to me 6 months ago, he became my tenant." Maurice almost laughed. "My son couldn't be a renter. He's a doctor with a thriving medical practice. He can buy any property in this town he wants." "I'm sure he can," Billings said, "but I have a lease agreement between him and myself." Maurice fell silent. He then turned to Halstead. "On the phone you said it was an emergency. What's going on?" Halstead cleared his throat. "When was the last time you spoke to your son, Mr. Weber?" "Not recently." "When? Can you be exact?" Maurice was beginning to get annoyed. He wanted them to get to the point, but he held his tongue. "I used to call him every day, But during the last couple of months, Jeffrey was busy with work, so we hadn't really talked. Halstead nodded and then looked over at Billings. "Tell him," he said. "Tell me what?" Maurice said, suddenly concerned. "Did something happen to them?" Billings cleared his throat. "Dr. Weber, your son, hasn't paid his rent for the last month." Maurice's face hardened. "Is this why I drove 200 miles? So that you could collect your rent?" Billings blushed, and he shook his head. No. What I meant to say was that I was here a month before. I came to pick up the rent like I always did. And at that time, when I'd knocked on the door, no one had answered." "Okay," Maurice said, trying hard to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't believe he was having this conversation. Jeffrey was always good with his money. This was the first time Maurice had any whiff of financial trouble regarding Jeffrey. Sheriff Halstead sensed the annoyance in Maurice's voice. He said, "Mr. Weber, when we came yesterday to check up on your son, we found these." Halstead held up a stack of mail. It was easy to spot envelopes with "overdue" labeled across them. They were strewn across the front doormat. Maurice's eyes narrowed. "Did you call Jeffrey? About the overdue rent?" "Of course I did," Billings said. "I've called them dozens of times, and each time it goes to voicemail." "Did you call his wife, Leslie?" Maurice said. Billings shook his head. "I don't have her number. I've always only spoken to Jeffrey." Maurice's heart started to beat faster. "Where is my son?" Halstead said, "Please follow me." They walked to the front of the house, up the 2 steps that led to the front porch, and then entered the house. Maurice assumed that Billings had used his key to unlock the door. The hallway was narrow and cramped, and this was because of the jackets hanging on the hooks on the wall. At the bottom, dozens of shoes sat on a shoe rack. There was an odd smell, one that Maurice was unsure of. He suddenly had a knot in the pit of his stomach. "Is my son okay?" Maurice said, turning to Halstead. "We're not sure," the sheriff replied. "What do you mean?" "Take a look." Halstead pointed to the kitchen. Chapter 2. Maurice went into the kitchen. The dining table looked like it had been set up perhaps for dinner. Plates, glasses, and cutlery were in place. Maurice glanced over at the stove and spotted 2 pots. He walked over and lifted the lid off one of the pots. The moment he did, he cringed. Whatever was in there had gone bad. He looked over and saw dishes in the sink. Halstead opened the fridge and said, "It's fully stocked. There is bread, milk, and eggs, and even meat in the freezer." Maurice suddenly felt uneasy. Halstead continued, "If you go to the bedrooms, you'll see the closet is filled with clothes and personal items. If you go to the bathroom, you will see all the toiletries and other hygiene products are still there." Maurice shut his eyes as a sharp pain shot through his head. He opened his eyes and said, "What are you trying to say?" "What I'm trying to say is that the people living in this house suddenly decided to get up and leave." "What do you mean, leave?" "If you look over there," Halstead nodded to the dining table. "They were about to have a meal, but then didn't." "Where is Jeffrey's car?" Maurice asked. Halstead pointed to the window above the kitchen sink. Maurice walked over and looked out. A silver SUV was parked next to a shed. "We ran the license plate," Halstead said, "and it is registered to a Jeffrey Weber." "What about Leslie?" "There is no car registered to her." "But that doesn't mean she didn't own a car," Maurice said. Halstead conceded that point. Maurice stared out into the backyard. "Are you saying you don't know where my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandkids are?" "We were hoping you could tell us," Halstead replied. "I wish I knew," Maurice exclaimed. "But I have no idea where they could have gone. In fact, I would have told you that over the phone if I'd known they were missing. Halstead looked over at Billings. He then said to Maurice, "Let me show you something." They walked to the living room. There was a sofa and armchair by the wall. Next to the armchair was a coffee table. On the table was a half-assembled jigsaw puzzle. There was a rug in the middle of the space. Halstead leaned down and lifted the rug up. Maurice could see hardwood flooring, but nothing else out of the ordinary. When Halstead pulled the rug completely up, that's when Maurice saw it. The flooring underneath the rug had a different shade than the rest of the floor in the room. When I was doing a walk around the space, I was trying to see if there had been any foul play, Halstead said. I happened to walk over the rug, and I heard a creaking noise. I then checked and found this. Halstead reached down and lifted up a piece of the flooring. There was a small cubby underneath the flooring, and inside it was a clear plastic bag filled with blue pills. "What are they?" Maurice asked. "Fentanyl." "Why would Jeffrey have it in his house?" Maurice asked, confused. "That's what we wanted to ask you," Halstead replied. Maurice stared at the plastic bag. By his estimate, there were probably close to 1,000 pills. Maybe he had them because of his practice. Maurice knew that was not correct the moment he said it. Doctors didn't store large quantities of drugs at home. It was illegal to do so. What if it was because of the thefts? Maurice offered. There was a rash of break-ins at clinics and pharmacies throughout the state. Addicts hooked on painkillers were doing everything they could to get their hands on their preferred drugs. Halstead nodded. I considered that, but it still doesn't explain why a doctor would have so much supply. It didn't, Maurice silently agreed. But that's not why we called you here, Mr. Weber, Halstead said. What we want to know is where is your son and where is his family? I don't know, Maurice replied in a state of shock. I really don't. There was a moment of silence. Halstead then said, Before calling you, we visited your son's practice. And? No one has seen him or your daughter-in-law in almost a month. That's around the time I'd come to collect the rent, Billings added. Maurice felt like the room was spinning. He reached for the wall to brace himself from falling. A month ago? He said, more to himself. He then looked at Halstead. Why didn't anyone from the clinic or my grandkids' school reach out to the authorities and say they were missing? That's the thing, Halstead said. The receptionist at the clinic said she'd received a call from Jeffrey that they were going on a trip, and he wasn't sure when they'd be back. And the boys' school's principal said he'd received a call from Jeffrey stating the same thing. Maurice stared at Halstead. But you don't believe they went on a trip, do you? Halstead shook his head. There's a table set in the kitchen. There's even a cooked meal on the stove. There's food in the fridge, clothes in the closets, and even the family car is parked on the property. But there is no sign of them anywhere. What are you saying? The words barely came out of Maurice's mouth. Halstead paused and then said, It's as if they've all vanished.